Well, we're talking again with Steve Hackett. It's always good to chat with him. He's got a new release out, which happens a lot, which is very good for an artist. So we always get new material or new compilations of material, and that's the latter here. Genesis Revisited Live, Seconds Out, and more. It's, I, I mean, in the annals of Genesis live albums, it it's either my favorite or my second favorite. I've always had a bit of a thing for the shorts and the longs because that was when I was really starting to get into the band. But then Seconds Out is probably one of
Sure.
the more hefty ones, if you will.
Right.
Why recreate this particular album live right now, or on a tour over the last year?
My goodness me. I made up my mind to start delivering whole Genesis albums. I was always doing cherry picking across the best of. But I decided first of all to do Selling England by the Pound when it was one of its anniversaries. And its successor, I felt, in spirit, was really Seconds Out, which involved some of the best of that. But the release which is coming out today, at least in the UK. I'm not sure if it's the same simultaneous release in the States, but it's released today, and I'm really thrilled with the sound of it. But I will be on tour doing Foxtrot soon, and then I'm coming back to the States, and we're going to do Seconds Out again. So I'm delivering things that go back 3 years ago. People bought tickets for shows which were postponed but not cancelled. And so I'm delivering in different parts of the world whatever was on the packet or promised way back in the day before the world got sick. So that's my comprehensive answer to your question.
And as I speak, I wanted to completely verify that it was out because as of the recording of this is September 2nd, and here in the States, it's the morning of. And lo and behold, there it is on Spotify, and I'm seeing it right now. And as I'm looking at it, I've already listened, and you know this, but for anyone listening right now, I've already listened, got the advanced preview, so I know what to talk about in the interview here. But the cover, for anyone who knows, that looks pretty close to the cover of the original Seconds Out. I have to imagine that was intentional.
It was absolutely intentional to give people a complete revisit and to make it recognizable. I know that it was a lot of people's favorite Genesis album, but I do believe that celebrating the early material and honoring that stuff that we all sweated blood to write back in the day, I wanted to make sure that the production values were not just the same or up to par, but increased, so that just a little bit, I think the sound of the album is arguably more powerful. The drums are more ambient, they are more compressed, there's a wonderful sound, and I think the performance of the band doesn't sound small, the guitar sound is better. I won't argue for the rest because, people will have their favorites and say, oh, Phil's my favorite drummer, etc., etc., but I'm just talking about in terms of the technical quality of it. I do believe that if you played it side by side, most people would say, yeah, I think this sounds more powerful.
It sounds very similar too, and that's obviously a thing. If you're going to do a thing called Genesis Revisited, and you were in the band, you'd probably want to try to recreate some of the particular sounds. As I'm listening to some of the synthesizer solos, I'm thinking like right now, Robbery, Assault and Battery is floating through my head, and I'm thinking of the synthesizer
Yes.
solos and the keyboard solos, and
Yep.
and
Yep.
trying to achieve that accuracy. Is that a matter of the band, your keyboardist, finding like the right patch to get that just right? Because you're obviously not going to be taking out 70s equipment and such. Like you're
No.
not trucking a Mellotron across the world anymore. But
No.
is that essentially what you're doing?
Well, I think that, Roger King is very good at observing what was there in the first place, but often we'll twin what was keyboard lines with brass or with woodwind, and to try and expand it and take the spirit of the original, but anytime it was heading towards being slightly symphonic or choral, we've taken it a stage further. And when I've re-recorded some of these things in the studio, as I have done with quite a lot of Genesis material. I've sometimes added an orchestra. I've sometimes had an orchestra with it live. And in order to flesh it out and to take those early attempts at something that sounds like it might have come out of the concert hall in a different kind of way that had a nod to symphonies and concertos and all of that, and to take it further and have it breathe.
And you kind of touched on this right now. It leads perfect to the next question about being faithful to the original arrangements. And
yeah.
I mean, if you want to take it even a step more micro, and being faithful to the way the Seconds Out arrangements were, and the way that the band was doing arrangements on the 77 tour and also the 76 tour, because some of the content's on that actual album, versus making those alterations you were referencing. And the ones that jump out at me, and you've done these alterations before, but hearing them in the context of Seconds Out, like I Know What I Like, is a bit of a bouncier feel to it. Sometimes you have, like some, was it saxophone, or I can't, blanking on the instrument right off the top of my head, but it's different than it was on that particular tour. How do you know when to make an alteration to an original, and the fans are going to ride with you on that, versus, well, we better keep this as is, or... You know how Genesis fans sometimes go. They'll be like, hey, why are you singing that?
I understand that Genesis fans were happy when we did variations upon the original, when we did it live back in the day.
Okay.
But I've got this idea of it not being revolutionary, but evolutionary. And I think that when you allow the guys to run with the ball and take things further, I mean, for instance, to do a track such as Cinema Show. Now, when Rob Townsend does woodwind stuff and uses a penny whistle on it during the instrumental section, I think that it only heightens it to take it into improvised areas, while the backing is basically fairly similar to the original. Of course, on the original recorded version, we had sped up guitar doing all sorts of fast things, but it wasn't particularly accurate. And I think that when you hear it now, it's much cleaner, and it varies it, for me, in a satisfying way. I mean, for instance, if the diehards, when I recorded some stuff at Hammersmith, the flute solo on First or Fifth, Rob picked up the soprano sax, which I think helps the melody enormously. And the guy shouted out, use the flute. The truth is that I'm not after reproducing the thing exactly. We're not a tribute band. This stuff evolves. I'm one of the writers of this stuff, and I want this stuff to fly. It's important that it honors the spirit of the original, but we're not slaves to it. And so when you get a variation, I'm only too happy to hear it. If you want it exactly the same, then play the album. Fine, but I want it to be expanded. I don't want, the choir to sound exactly like the Mellotron choir back then. I want something that's cleaner and brighter and sounds more obviously choral. And so, everything I do is to improve the sound. And I do believe the guitar sound is better. Unless what you like is, a guitar through a fuzz box with excessive chorus on the whole thing, which is what the original had, and at times inaudible. I remember Tony Banks saying very proudly, "Yeah, we mixed Steve out of the picture on that." Well, what you get by comparison is you get clarity, you get improved tone, and all the rest. But I may be, pissing in the wind here, and for those who consider it to be the gospel from on high, that isn't the way I see it. I don't see anything as beyond improvement. I mean, I was listening the other day while I was rehearsing stuff from Foxtrot. I was listening to a version of Watcher of the Skies, for instance, and I thought I was listening to the original live version from Leicester, de Montfort Hall. And then about halfway through, I realized it was actually my band recorded at the Liverpool Philharmonic Hall, and I thought, damn, Peter sounds really good on this. But I realized it was Mad Sylvan singing it, and the mellotron sound sounded absolutely mighty, and the crowd roared in the same way. And for me, I'm proud of those things, but we will add things to the mellotron, so you get the spirit of it, but it's fuller. Not only do we use mellotron samples before they've gone through the mellotron, the original tapes that were recorded, 3 Women in a Bedroom in 1953, somewhere around the New York area, we add to that with modern samples, so it doesn't just go thin and nasty and distorted, but with modern samples that perhaps give it back its symphonic aspirations back in the day. So I don't want to get too pedantic about this, but all I can say is to people, listen to yourself and see if you enjoy the updates.
Well, and another way of looking at recorded versus live is recording is when you're putting it down, you put it on tape, and there are all the studio circumstances and record issuing timetable. There's all of that, and then you get to live with a song and develop it as it goes. I can think of certain aspects of, say, like The Last Domino that were changed immediately after Invisible Touch came out, and they were the same right up through the Last Domino tour this past year, and that's how it's been ever since. And I have to imagine that was a decision on the part of, was probably Tony. I'm thinking of some of his keyboard parts that probably went, I'd rather do it this way. Maybe it was a live setting, maybe it was just his choice, and that's the way it's been, and really that's the song. So in your case, it kind of a similar sort of question about, as you perform them live, is there anything that you found in all these Genesis Revisited shows and such, or anytime you perform material from the band where you go, now I have the opportunity to do something that I kind of always wanted to do, but we couldn't do it in the studio, we couldn't do it live back in 73, 74, etc., but we can do it now, and this is really how I, as a writer, envisioned it to be?
Yeah, well, I would say, some of, I'll quote Watch of the Skies, because that's something that I loved, the Foxtrot album, but I was very disappointed with the sound of the mellotron at the beginning, the size of it, which sounds kind of boxy. So when I did a re-record of it, I tried to honor the spirit of the way it sounded when we first played that and wrote some of it in Italian Palasports. Before it was finished, at sound check, we were doing that, and the close team were getting thrilled at that, our promoters, etc. But that shook the foundations, and there was a lot of ambience with it, in the sports halls. So when I did a re-record on Genesis Revisited #1 with Bill Bruford and John Wetton, the late great John Wetton, I absolutely flooded it with reverb, and not only that, I used a symphony orchestra as well. I mean, we had the Royal Philharmonic on that as well as the mellotron, so you've got the best of both worlds. You've got a machine attempting to be an orchestra and an orchestra attempting to be a mellotron, and what you get is something hugely powerful and absolutely symphonic. So, you get the ostinato moments, the kind of fanfare stuff at the end of that mellotron intro, and we added brass to make it sound truly Cecil B. DeMille. That was how I saw it. I always wanted Genesis to become an orchestra and start to use an orchestra in the way that the Beatles were mature enough to down their own instruments at times and to have the old instruments there under the banner of, or the baton of George Martin. And for me, that's when the Beatles became truly interesting, when they stopped being a mere pop group and took on board not just symphony orchestra input, but also world music, the invitation of all those musicians from way across the water, and they started to really blossom, and every musician in the world pricked up their ears and went, this is interesting. They have transcended their limitations and their roots, and even though that stuff from the old days was great, this has become truly mighty. There's the search for identity versus the idea of real improvement and stepping outside the confines of what you are personally capable of, and to perhaps hand it over is one word, but it's more than that. I'm searching for the right word here. When you say, I love what other people can do. Every instrument has got its place, even the humble triangle. And when that era started to happen, we refer to it laughingly as the psychedelic era, but somehow, if you ask a lot of musicians, they'll say, yes, their favorite track is Eye on the Walrus, because you've got a rock band plus a symphony orchestra in tow, and aspects of big band and cartoon work and Disney-esque stuff. And the first time you heard that, you didn't know who it was. That was where music really started to shake the walls of the city.
Why did you choose the additional tracks to perform on this tour, i.e., The Devil's Cathedral, a couple of the Spectral Morning songs? What was the decision process for the solo Hackett part of the early part of the show?
Because most of those songs were road tested, and stuff like Clocks used to bring the house down. Stuff like Every Day has always had a very good reception. And I did two things from the current album. The current album was Surrender of Silence, the current studio album. Devil's Cathedral was always written in a Genesis style, but then you've got the addition of pipe organ and soprano sax. Now, soprano sax, you could argue, is a profane instrument from jazz, and you've got pipe organ, which is associated with sacred music. But those guys are improvising around octatonic scales, and it's different every night, and it's always wonderful, and it's always really out there. So you've got a mixture of jazz and classical influences just for the intro alone. And then we go into the band work, which I think honors the spirit of a lot of what Genesis did. Something that doesn't falter and is surprising, where the energy just goes up and up and up as it perhaps gets faster and faster and more furious. And for me, I find that very much in the spirit of favorite Genesis songs such as Dancing with the Moonlit Night, where something starts out as one thing, but it becomes another. So that's that song. And plus I wanted to do one of the others, which is Hole in the Shadows, which I felt would take off truly if, unlike the version that's on record, we allow it to where we have trading phrases with Rob Townsend and myself. So soprano sax becomes tenor sax or alto later on, and of course guitars there the whole time. But it's the kind of stuff where I was really going for it. It's slightly psychedelic on the recorded version, the studio version, but live it becomes something else. Just to give people, a couple of glimpses of the stuff that's current as well as the stuff that's still valid but antique. All of these revisits are, in rock and roll terms, to go back 45 years or 50 years in the case of some of this stuff. You're talking about antique in rock and roll terms, and it's important to have the new stuff as well, as far as I'm concerned, even though there's just a few things in there, and it's a much shorter set, but we do the whole of, for instance, Shadow of the Hierophant. Now, that was from 1975. Now, some of that stuff had been rehearsed by Genesis in 72, when we were putting together what was to become Foxtrot. But there were many things that didn't make it onto the album at the time that I felt were potentially brilliant, and one or two of those things became huge hits subsequently. So with a with a revisit, I'm able to do that. But I wanted to give people a glimpse again at the power of the early work of the band, and I think that takes off in such a huge way. Shadow of the Hierophant is always received when it's done in its entirety in a huge way, because it really shakes the foundations of the building. Something that starts out very, very quietly, the section that has glockenspiel at the front, and then absolutely thunders, gets louder and louder on a repeated pattern. It's compelling live. I know that it's very emotional for me when I'm playing it. So it's got the aspect of Greek tragedy, the Oresteia, all of those things that I think that Genesis Spirit headed towards in the early days, which is why it survived. It has survived reinterpretations by school bands, by tribute bands, by orchestras, by jazz people. And so it's a testament to the quality of the writing that we had so many things that we were able to sideline some things, bring them back the following year. And for instance, I Know What I Like was a reject. It was something I kicked off with the band in 1972. It was rejected only to be taken back into the fold, that lost sheep of a song, and it became the band's first hit single. So, a band doesn't always know what it has in front of them. It's the same with Pink Floyd when they were doing music for whatever it was, The Valley Obscured by Clouds, and they brought that back, I think, in order to be part of Us and Them, from their huge selling Dark Side of the Moon. That's what bands do when they've got excess material. But there it was staring them in the face, and there it was staring Genesis in the face. And after I'd done Shadow of the Hierophant, Tony Banks said to me, we could have used that for Genesis. And I thought, well, 3 years later, it's unlikely that it's going to have a reappraisal by the band that's going to be used. But there you go. At least it had 3 members of Genesis on it. And also my brother. So, you had a 3-man team of Genesis plus the Hackett brothers. And so I think it was very, very powerful, and I'm very proud of it.
The whole thing ends up seamless on this particular recording to the point where you go, oh, okay, as I'm listening to it, it melds really well with what's actually on Seconds Out.
I like to think so. So I'm not moving too far away from the spirit of Genesis and those Genesis sessions. So, Genesis is a tree with many branches.
To that point, we're coming up on a half year since what I believe we all believe you might have somewhat of a better idea having been in the band and knowing the personalities involved. But best as we could tell, when Phil Collins said at the show in London that this is the final Genesis show, that might actually be it. And then you start seeing the whole label of Genesis Live 2022. I can't, the years are slipping my mind, but you'd start to see that stuff in the media like that was the final Genesis show. So let's go with the presumption. If they are done as a live band, and you being part of Genesis, the history of Genesis, assess the live legacy. I never say never with any group that they'll never, ever, 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 ever do anything again, but assess the live legacy. You're talking about the spirit of Genesis. Assess that as one of the very few who was part of that.
Well, for me, I'm going to answer your question in a roundabout sort of way. They were doing their final show. Now, I know Peter Gabriel turned up and the pictures with him and everything, although he wasn't performing. I would have done the same, but I'd undertaken to do a show that had been, a tour that had been postponed for a long time, and that was to go back and honor those commitments in the United States. And so I felt, if I'm going to do that, I better not turn up at a show where I'm likely to catch COVID, and then all those fans are let down again. So I didn't do that. Now, I honor the spirit of the early work of the band with at least half of my show, if not more so. And it's important for me to do that because I think that those songs were incredibly well composed, beautifully written, wonderful harmonic progressions, and I really do think that a lot of it is the best of the British. Now, John Lennon said at one point that there were a couple of bands that he considered to be true sons of the Beatles, and one of those was Genesis. Now, I had no idea at the time that he was getting stuff sent to him in New York from Nursery Crime onwards, and that's the album that Phil Collins and I both joined the band on. So I'm very proud of that because we spent so much time learning from the Beatles. And so I think, for me, it isn't over. The dream isn't over. Unlike, Lennon's comment about the Beatles, the dream is over. It isn't over because, for me, the spirit of that goes on. And, with that level of encouragement from all sorts of quarters where, I've had the ear of people as disparate as John Lennon and Yehudi Menuhin, a classical musician, using stuff that I've written. So I realize it must touch upon a number of people from a number of different schools. And so if you put it all together, it seems that it's either fusion or it's collision. Progressive doesn't begin to even describe it. Those songs are really truly wonderful, and I'm going to go out and perform the whole of Foxtrot next. I'm in rehearsals as of 2 days' time for me with my band, and I'm looking forward to that tremendously because I know we'll be bringing people's dreams alive again. It's lovely work. I think Foxtrot is a fabulous album as it happens, and so there will be a live album of that inevitably, but there is crossover with Foxtrot. This the whole of Supper's Ready, where you have 23 minutes of the original Supper's Ready being performed to the letter, and that for me, perfect length for a hit single. Of course not, but that's because live shows at a time when we weren't getting radio support was all important. All we had was the live shows and the dedication of fans who came to see it, and I cannot let that dream die. Just because, the official Genesis may say that they're hanging up their spurs and that's it. And I realise, with Phil's health, of course, they won't go out and do another show with him. That's plainly obvious, unless he suddenly decides, it'll be mind over matter, and he's going to do that no matter what. And everyone is entitled to do that, but the likelihood is that what I'm doing will be the nearest thing, but there'll be different players. There'll be different interpreters of that. But, if you consider this to be the classical music of tomorrow, and I know Richie Havens was telling me that's where he considered it to be when I was working with him, then you have to remember that if you go and watch Bach or Tchaikovsky or Beethoven, it's all tribute bands doing it because we're never going to get the original out there. They're long gone. But the quality of the work is what sustains and makes it immortal. And so I have to say I was, hugely proud when Genesis was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and it has to be the music that survives.
It continue. Go on.
Yeah, and so I'm not going to let that die. It's important to me, having sweated blood for it back in the day, and I do truly believe in it. Whether I write something in the spirit of Genesis, I've got songs like Camino Royale, and part of that was from a Genesis dream. So I know that I'm at one with the spirit of it, and it was a brilliant band, and who knows, we may not see its like again, but it's important for me to get out there while I'm able-bodied and of sane mind to go out there and